This week on Inside Olympia, police accountability is a top issue in the legislature this year, from police tactics to independent investigations to rules for the use of deadly force. It's all up for debate. On the program, House Public Safety Chair Roger Goodman and Gina Mosbrucker, the ranking Republican in that committee. Plus, pollster Stuart Elway on these divided times we're in.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. The country is divided and Washington is divided. So how did we get to this point? In our second half, we'll talk with longtime pollster Stuart Elway. But first, police reform and accountability is front and center this legislative session. A dozen or so bills are making their way through the process on topics ranging from independent investigations to police tactics to the decertification of officers. Joining me now to talk about this push for reform is Democrat Roger Goodman, who chairs the House Public Safety Committee, and State Representative Gina Mosbrucker, who is the ranking Republican on that committee. Welcome, both of you, to Inside Olympia. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Let me just start with a broad set the stage question, and I'll start with you, Representative Goodman, as the chair of the committee. What is, as you entered this legislative session, what was the problem statement that you were hoping to address, or the thesis behind all of these bills, or the organizing principle? Because clearly there is a theme here. It comes after 2020, which has been described as a year of racial reckoning and very high-profile deaths of African Americans involving the police, and the killing of George Floyd in particular in Minneapolis, which sparked protests across the country. So as you came into this session and prepared for this session, what was driving you?
So certainly the impetus for this reform was the events of 2020. The marches in the streets across the country call for racial justice and reform of the justice system. The way I would frame what we're doing in the legislature now is in three parts. First is to hold accountable those police officers who engage in misconduct, and very often, not very often, but too often, egregious misconduct or patterns of repeated misconduct. Needless to say, most police are decent and hardworking and work for us and run into the danger. And yet there is misconduct that has not been held accountable, and we have to adjust the law to make that happen. The second is just in general to improve the relationship between police and the community. We've made progress already in this state with the passage of Initiative 940 related to the use of deadly force. That helped to bring the parties together, and so that's a platform or foundation for further reform. But we need to improve the relationship between the police and the community further. And finally is the policing profession itself. I want to help police uphold their own profession, professionalize the police even more, and so to help them as well. So it's really a balance of all three of those factors.
Okay. Representative Mosbrucker, you're the ranking member of this committee. As far as I can tell, you're not co-sponsoring any of these police accountability bills that are prime sponsored by majority Democrats. You do have a number of other bills that you're sponsoring. How are you thinking about this time, this moment in time, as it relates to the topic of police accountability, or more broadly, public safety?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having us here today. I think we all agree that we always want to improve, and I don't think there's anyone who objects to police reform and making everything better that we do on all policy areas. Our heart goes out to anyone who's been harmed by law enforcement, or anyone who's been harmed in general during this state of emergency pandemic through COVID. I think that the police accountability bills, we fully believe that if there's bad police officers who break the law and harm people, they should be held accountable to the full extent of the law. That's not been something that we've argued, absolutely not. At the same time, we have to remember that, again, just as the good Mr. Goodman said, is that we have to make sure we realize that these are the officers who run into danger. You and I run away as quick as possible for safety. They run in, and that their job is unique and different. And we just want to make sure that these bills on police accountability continue to also protect the officer, and to also protect nearby civilians who may be at the scene of terrible incident. So it's not that we're opposed to accountability. It's just that we want to make sure that it's not restricting the officers from being able to do their jobs and to keep those around them safe.
And we will get into some of the specific proposals here in a moment, but let's just explore this a little bit more. I'd be interested to hear from both of you. Where do you see the fault lines here, especially now that you're a few weeks into the session and most of these bills have had public hearings, if not already been moved out of committee? Representative Goodman, what are you observing about, I think these have been, in some cases, party line votes, in other cases there's bipartisan support, but what fault lines are emerging?
Yeah, there's certainly some division. We'll see party line votes because there's not full agreement, right? Some of these bills, there's soft opposition. Other measures, there's fairly strident opposition. I would say that in general, we all agree that we need to collect better data to know what's going on out there. I think that we need a stronger community voice. I think if there's any major fault line, it's when can deadly force be used? When deadly force is used by law enforcement, it makes the news, and it can disrupt families and communities. And so the question of when use of deadly force is justified is a key question that we are fairly sharply divided on right now. I do have to say, though, that we've been very collaborative and quite amicable, and everybody's at the table and staying at the table. And we're engaging in these disagreements in a respectful and agreeable way.
And Representative Mosbrucker, I don't necessarily hear you saying these are misplaced priorities, but do you feel like there's too much emphasis here, or it's in the wrong place? I know that there are other measures that have been brought forward by Republicans, for instance, to provide mental health support for law enforcement officers, to establish a pilot project to try to find ways to recruit more diverse candidates for policing. But you also have proposals, for instance, around curbing domestic violence, and I know that you've been very involved in the missing and murdered Indigenous women efforts. So this is a committee with broad jurisdiction, not just police accountability. Do you feel like the emphasis is in the wrong place, or that there is too much emphasis right now on this broad umbrella of police accountability?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that this is an important issue. I do think, however, that public safety has many, many elements in it, and we need to address as many as possible in this 105-day session. There is agreement on the fact that we need more training, we need more tools, and so there's agreement on the data collection, trying to make sure we further understand ways to connect law enforcement to their communities. I think that's where the breakdown came. I think that we lost that trust, that transparency, and I think it's Chair Goodman and I's job to try to figure out how to get that back. When we put SRO officers, the student resource officers in schools, we're building relationships with the youth for the next generation. Good relationships of having that law enforcement entity in a positive way. You know, maybe they become a friend or a mentor, and I think we can do a better job at that. I think just anyway, there's a diversity bill that Representative Maycomer also has, as well as the mental health bill, that just says we're going to look at ways to incentivize and create grants so there's more diversity in policing in their communities. We want to encourage people to get into law enforcement, and we're afraid that some of these restrictive bills on accountability are going to prevent that. Officers are concerned for their safety as well as those around them, at the same time as the person who's allegedly committed the crime. Their job is to keep everyone safe. And as you said, there's issues around domestic violence, especially now that we have COVID and we're in our homes more. It's increased, and there's no place for them to go for safety. So there's many issues to work on. We do feel like this is important. We feel like we need to also discuss these other issues and not only focus on this one issue.
Okay. Well, let's dive into some of the specifics, and I do want to spend a little bit of time specifically on the bill that would change or establish a new standard for use of force. And Representative Goodman, you referenced this, but I have to confess I'm a little confused. Is this it was just a couple of years ago that I-940 passed, and the legislature then worked with law enforcement to craft a new definition of when deadly force is allowed. It was the good faith measure. We had, prior to this, had sort of the highest bar in the nation for prosecuting officers for unlawful use of deadly force. So we do have a new set of rules on the books. Would this bill that's being considered write essentially a whole new rule and replace what just got put on the books? Am I understanding this correctly?
Potentially, yes. I still bear the scars and the bruises from 2 years ago. Although it was a successful effort, we brought together police and the communities affected to agree on new language that sets the bar for what is justifiable use of deadly force. However, in the last 2 years, there have been 100 or more further deaths with police interaction, and yet only one prosecution has been brought. So the communities affected are still very concerned. So there is legislation to take a look at that particular section of law, again, the justifiable homicide statute, and to frame it differently, that the use of deadly force by law enforcement shouldn't be measured by what is reasonable, but by what is necessary. So really raising the threshold for the use of deadly force and to focus more on de-escalation and to honor the sanctity of life to a higher degree.
And I can maybe be a little bit more specific. We had previously this without malice, that you had to show that the officer acted with malice. That was removed. So now we have this good faith standard. And as I understand it, this new standard would be essentially a last resort standard. You have exhausted all other options, and this is your last resort. So Representative Mosbrucker, what's your thought on this potential change, especially coming so close on the heels of establishing the 940 standard?
I think that we need to, it's frustrating when we set standards in law and we do the work that causes the bruise and the pain, and I've been in many negotiations, such as Chair Goodman mentioned, but we don't give it a chance to fully become enacted and to see what it's going to do, so we can collect data and we can see if our work was exactly what we needed to do. So when we keep changing the rules, it makes it really difficult for law enforcement to understand exactly what's being expected. Of course, our hearts break for anyone who's been harmed in any way. But at the same time, there's times in a law enforcement situation where you don't have a chance to de-escalate. I mean, when you're in a situation where it's your life or theirs, or your life or someone next to you, a civilian, you or I, there's not a chance to go through all of those steps. You just have to take quick action in order to save your life as well as those around you. So we're really trying to make sure we're not using, a blanket approach on this. So for example, if there's a school shooter and they have a gun in a school, and they leave and they take their gun and they rush to another building or another room, we go after them, we pursue them. But is that last resort? I think the definitions are unclear. We have to be able to make sure we can protect that the children that are still in the classroom, as well as taking that gun and going to another and doing more harm. I mean, there's a lot of issues around being able to legally pursue someone in order to stop them from harming the next classroom full of kids, for example. So there's a lot of work. It's very difficult work. It's comprehensive. It's complex. And we feel like with some of the pieces of 1310, which is a use of force bill that we'll be looking at today, again, we have to make sure we're not handcuffing the police and law enforcement in order to keep us safe. And I would think that this needs a more further discussion. If we're making this big change, we're hearing from many law enforcement agencies that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And we're worried that this is rushed through in a way that will make it very difficult for law enforcement in the state of Washington to do their job.
Well, and Representative Goodman, I'd like to give you a chance to respond to some of those concerns and criticisms, but also give us kind of a reality check. Is this how much momentum is behind this particular bill and particular change this year, given that it is significant? What are its prospects at this point?
Well, this is an example of the need to gather all of the interested parties around the table, as we did 2 years ago with Initiative 940. It does feel quite rushed because of the cumbersome nature of this legislative session being remote. The three of us are now in different locations rather than sitting in the same studio, and none of us are able to sit in the same room to negotiate or to legislate. We're doing the best we can. I will say that this is the first step, and although there's perhaps sharp disagreement, that Representative Mosbrucker and I are committed to bringing together the parties to take a look at the language. The statutes are, comprised of words and language, and we have to talk about and more closely define what it means to be necessary, or what does last resort mean, and so forth. So we're at the first step now, and there is still sharp disagreement, but we're at the table, and we're going to continue to talk about it. This bill related to the use of deadly force is one of the keystones of the reform package. The other ones are still, there's disagreement, but I think we're going to come closer to consensus on the issues of, for instance, when should we decertify officers or take the license away from officers who clearly have been engaged in misconduct, and how should investigations proceed after there is a critical incident, and so forth. There's many other issues to consider.
So what I hear you saying is that this particular change may have to be worked a little bit more.
Oh, all of them, yeah. All of the bills need more work.
Well,
I can give you one of the most interesting bills is the tactics.
Let me. No, I want to get to this, the other specifics, but just before we move on from this one, do you anticipate in this session that this bill 1310 has a good chance of getting through, and that the rules around the use of deadly force are likely to change? Or are you seeing this more as the beginning of a discussion that's probably going to take another session or two?
That particular bill, House Bill 1310, has two parts to it. The first is to establish in law a duty of reasonable care, let's say, that law enforcement need to be trained to and to follow. And if they breach that duty, then they can be held liable. There is no such clear duty right now in law that's uniform across the state. The second then is the justifiable homicide statute. So it's a different section of law, and that's about criminal liability. That was the center of Initiative 940. And so those two pieces are moving forward, and we'll see whether both of them make it through. I believe that establishing a clear duty in law is really important at this point.
And so in that sense, these two things could be uncoupled or delinked.
Right now they're together, and they're moving forward together. But we're going to continue to stay at the table and negotiate all of that.
Just briefly, Representative Mosbrucker, this concept of a duty of care, as described in the bill, is that something you are comfortable with at this point, or not comfortable with?
I think it still needs a lot of work. I appreciate that we are at the table and that we're having these discussions. We really are pushing to slow this down and look into this deeply so that no one gets hurt, no matter any. So we're not comfortable with that currently at this time. And again, it really needs to go back to the table, and we're going to push hard to get to do that.
Okay. I don't know if I mentioned this previously, but there's a dozen or so bills on this topic moving this legislative session. We aren't going to obviously get to all of them, but I know, Representative Goodman, you were about to mention the police tactics bill. Before we get there, I would like to ask you both about the governor request legislation to create a new Office of Independent Investigations that would be housed in the governor's office to investigate use of deadly force. This also comes in the wake of 940, where we have a system now of these independent teams that are supposed to be regional in nature, and where we make sure that the involved agency isn't investigating itself. When reading this bill language, Representative Goodman, one thing that struck me is that the new office would have the ability to say, yes, we want to go in and investigate this particular case, or defer to I think it's the IIT, the existing system.
Yes.
Right there, I'm sort of puzzled about how, in the moment, the governor's office, would be able to determine right after a shooting whether it wants to roll on that one or not roll on that one. There didn't seem to be any kind of guidance about that.
Well, remember, this is not the governor's office. This is actually would be an independent state
right under the
entity in the
auspices
executive branch, basically. Yeah. And so it's not the governor's office that's going to decide whether or not to take over the scene. These would be trained, highly trained investigators and a whole sort of bureaucracy actually deciding case by case whether they should take over from the independent investigation team in that particular region. The need to reform the investigations of deadly force incidents is in two steps. We actually have another bill, which is probably going to come to the House floor pretty soon. And I think there's agreement on this, that the current protocol for independent investigations is not quite complete, and that we need an audit or a final check to make sure that these investigations were done properly. And so the state auditor's office would actually be doing those audits and also auditing police agencies around the state to make sure that they have the protocols in place if an incident happens so that they can take into action. The second then is this creation of an entirely independent state office. And we actually today, we are going to be amending this bill to make it more clear about when the office does step in and when they let the regional independent investigation team continue their own work.
So what would the trigger be, just in a nutshell?
Well, that's actually a case by case and according to the expertise of the investigators. It's not, I mean, perhaps in a particular scene they would find the investigation was lacking in some way, or that the incident was so critical that the state would have to step in to a lot of this is about public confidence in the police, right? And so if you have, and unfortunately we've had police agencies investigating themselves even now, violating the law and kind of ruining it for everybody, so that there's really not a lot of trust in the idea of the police investigating the police, kind of the fox guarding the hen house. And so this state office would have to step in to see, whether in a particular case it's appropriate for them to take over.
Okay. The idea is this would be a civilian-run independent agency. It would also, as the bill is written currently, require that the investigation apply a racial equity lens to looking at the actions of the officers and what happened in the particular incident. Representative Mosbrucker, your thoughts on setting up this new independent office under the executive branch?
Of course, we're in favor of accountability. We feel like it's unclear, as you had stated, that the standard to start that trigger on moving forward, right? There's not a standard that says in these particular cases, we're going to investigate. We feel like that's unclear, and it's not, we'd like to have a really good idea of what sets it forward. And I think that that's probably not asking too much. Again, these bills are very emotional, and we understand the timeliness. We absolutely think that things should be looked at with a racial equity lens. But at the same time, these are bills that are very comprehensive and complex and should be done in a year from now, right? We should be pushing them forward in order to make sure that we're doing exactly what we need to do in order to protect law enforcement as well as others. And I feel like this rush nature leaves a lot of unanswered questions, just as the chair had stated. And it's really important for us to work together, which we've done an amazing job at it. I really appreciate the cooperative nature of working through these bills. They're too rushed. We don't have time to sit down and make sure that it's done correctly in a way that's respectful for everyone. And so again, it's just that frustration over pushing big comprehensive issues and huge changes where we haven't had a chance to get back to the recent decisions on how to move forward. So
I think Representative Mosbrucker just made a really important point, and that there's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of emotion on both sides. There's emotion from law enforcement who are dedicated and really worried that maybe some tools are being taken away from them or they're being overly restricted. And then there's a lot of emotion from communities, some communities feeling like they're getting shot at and for a long time and are feeling quite vulnerable. And I think what Representative Mosbrucker and I are committed to do is take that emotion from all sides and channel it so that we come up with workable legislation, workable laws. And yes, it might feel rushed right now, but I think, again, we're still just at the beginning. February has started, and we have all the way until April to work this out. So we're working very intensively, but I think there's going to be enough time to work out most of the issues.
Do you think if there's a dozen or nearly a dozen bills, Representative Goodman, that all of them are on track at this point for potentially getting through in this session? Or is this more of you're looking for or anticipating that maybe a few of them would happen this year and then the conversation to be continued in out years?
Well, right, I just counted my list here, and there are 16 bills.
Okay,
By the
I'm
way,
undercounting.
we started at 60 back in the summer, so we whittled them down to what are truly the priorities. All 16 of those bills are still very much alive. And so we'll see whether all of them make it across the finish line, but we're being very deliberate about each measure. And again, just in the beginning of the process now. So it could be that all 16 become law. That would be a miracle, I think. But so far, all of them are still very much alive.
Okay. In the few minutes we have left, I do want to ask you about the police tactics bill. I listened and covered the first hearing. The bill has changed since then, and there's a long list in that bill. It's a Representative Jesse Johnson bill that would really apply new rules to everything from tactics like police chokeholds, banning them, to vehicle pursuit rules, to the use of canines. Representative Goodman, I don't expect you to have your finger on every detail that changed, but can you speak to, there is a substitute bill now. What jumps out at you about how the testimony informed the thinking around this and how the bill changed?
Yeah, you have to take a look at each tactic one by one here. And
there's a lot of them, so we don't have to do all of them. But there
are.
I can mention, though, it is the ban on chokeholds, the ban on the use of police dogs to effect an arrest, the ban on tear gas, and now I think restrictions on military-grade equipment. Essentially, a ban on vehicle pursuits unless certain circumstances are met. And then I think there's also an issue or rules around shooting into a moving vehicle.
Yeah, so some of these tactics, such as chokeholds, no-knock warrants, use of tear gas, would be an outright ban. And then the use of those tactics to save the life of another would still be allowed because the law allows for those sorts of things. You can break into a house to save a life. You don't need a no-knock warrant for that purpose. And then for other tactics, we would be restricting their use, such as shooting at moving vehicles and high-speed chases. I think the two remaining issues that really we need to sit down at the table and talk about are the use of canines. A lot of testimony there that really has informed our work, and so we want to pause and take a look at how canines are going to be used in police practice. And then the other one is about military equipment. We need to be more careful, more discreet, more concrete about how we define military equipment and be very specific about it.
Yeah, and Representative Mosbrucker, there's this tension because there are communities that are feeling like a militarized police presence is in their neighborhoods. On the other hand, as you've noted, we have had, there are school shootings where police are facing an active shooter and where some of this equipment can be brought to bear. We just saw the tragedy in South Florida with the FBI agents who were shot and killed this week. Just briefly on this police tactics bill, and as you see it evolving, do you see it getting to a place where you could imagine supporting it, or is it at this point still just too far from anything that you could back?
Well, at this point, it's too far. I think that we understand many of those, and there were some that we found agreement on, which was great. We were asked to give ID and make sure it was not covered or away. And the other side, they went through and said, if it's okay to show that you block over your badge for a fallen soldier, the black line that we put over, we want to make sure that that was there, and they listened and they adjusted to that. As the chair said, we have the piece on canines. There's a meeting on Monday. We appreciate, we do not think that canines shouldn't be banned. And as the original bill, the proposed sub says that that's the case, and we think that you can safely use canines and that they're another way to build a relationship with community. The police dogs used to come in for assemblies at my school, and it was the most popular assembly, just building those relationships with law enforcement. I think there's a safe way to do that. And then also the military piece, the bill went too far, and it banned the fact that police cars can't put metal in the doors. And in Yakima, for example, that's critical, not only to keep the law enforcement officer from being shot at. We have a gang situation in Yakima often that, harms civilians and the law officers, but also that piece of metal that's in the door protects when we pick up a civilian in a bad situation. It protects them as well, or somebody that has been arrested. When someone's shooting at that car, the bill just went too far. It still goes too far, but we do appreciate a little bit of movement that's happened, and we look forward to more discussions to make sure we clarify these pieces.
Okay.
And that's an example of where the testimony and our consultation with the experts really made a difference. So there's armored vehicles versus armed vehicles, right? So we're going to permit absolutely armored vehicles to protect those inside. But armed vehicles, those are military, you're not going to be arming a vehicle with a weapon.
Right.
That's more military use.
We have just a couple minutes left, and we are focused on police accountability here. I've also asked about a lot of questions that the majority party is sponsoring. Representative Mosbrucker, in the time we have left, let me ask you about a bill that you're sponsoring that is not related to police accountability, but is related to the times we're in, the COVID crisis, and it would establish the Washington Youth Suicide Review Team to review the circumstances related to suicides occurring among youth aged 24 and below. Just briefly, what is your thinking and what's the motivation behind this? Well, how do you hope it would, how do you hope this would help?
It would help because we would take all of the cases of suicide, age 24 and under, which that 20s age is really high. So we went farther than 18, the typical age, and we're going to lay them out from 2020 and see what the nexus and the connections are, because I fear that there's some things that we're missing on these youth suicides that is in common with each other. Maybe it's cyberbullying, maybe it's they were on medication, maybe they had sexual assault incidents earlier. We have to find that nexus in order to find the answers and intercept these suicidal tendencies. There's a statistic that came out from OSPI, and 16% of our youth from 15 to 19 have a suicide plan currently. And it's devastating. It's on the rise because the kids have so many losses. They have a loss of education. They have a loss of social time with their friends. They have a loss of just opportunity to do the things that they planned on doing in life due to this pandemic. This feels really critical. I'm very grateful for those who testified and told their heartbreaking stories of how suicides affected their lives.
And I've been struck by just the age of some of the youth who have died by suicide, as you hear about 9, 10, 11-year-olds now, so which is just devastating. Representative Goodman, what have the two of you been able to talk about this proposal? I don't even know if this is assigned to your committee. It may not be.
It's not. Yeah. It's not actually. Representative Mosbrucker and I have been working for years on domestic violence issues. She has a very interesting bill she's introduced related to coercive control that we'll be hearing soon. I'm very intrigued by putting that concept into the law.
Okay. Well, we are out of time. A lot more to talk about on the specific topic of police accountability and the broader umbrella of public safety. I hope we can continue the conversation in the future. But for now, I appreciate you both being here and talking about these issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And
thank you.
When we return, why are we so divided as a nation and as a state? We talk with longtime pollster Stuart Elway. Back after this.
The problem? Just 1 in 4 Americans can correctly name all 3 branches of government. The solution? Watch TVW. On TV and on the web, TVW brings you all 3 branches of your state government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Your civic education starts with TVW.
And welcome back to Inside Olympia. Stuart Elway has been polling Washington voters for decades, and he's watched the state go from purple to solidly blue and seemingly getting bluer. He's also watched as voters in this once very independent-minded state have gotten more partisan. It's a reflection of what's happening nationally. So why is this happening, and what does it say about our politics and our future. Joining me now is longtime pollster Stuart Elway. Welcome back to the program. Great to see you.
Glad to be here.
Just as we think about the moment we find ourselves in and coming out of the Trump presidency, and then also looking to past moments of division in this country. In particular, you were very involved in Republican politics in this state during the late 60s. You worked for Dan Evans, the Republican governor. Are there comparables, or are we in sort of uncharted waters here?
Well, there's certainly similarities. In the 60s, the Republican Party was, Barry Goldwater had run in 64, and the strong right-wing element had made itself known in the Republican Party. We spent a lot of time around the Evans administration fighting off the right wing of the party. So there's similarities there as the parties in today's time are having the same sorts of internal battles. Democrats also had Peace Party, and then the war hawks, LBJ and McCarthy. So that party was having its own sort of intramural warfare, and people were marching in the streets. A very turbulent time. So there are similarities to what we're seeing now. This time later?
What was your reaction to the events of January 6th and watching a mob take over the U.S. Capitol unfolding on our TV screens?
Well, like many, I was pretty horrified. I thought it was serious. This was an insurgency. This was a mob breaching the Capitol, breaking windows, desecrating the halls of Congress. It was a serious moment that needs not to be downplayed, I think. It was, like many, I thought we'd never see anything like that in the United States of America. It looked like we were seeing footage from, Paraguay or someplace.
And of course, we're still in the midst of all of this. I mean, there's a impeachment ongoing and a new administration taking over. Nothing has been sorted out or figured out. We don't know what the future is going to look like politically. And of course, we're still in the midst of the pandemic, which has become very political. Just before I ask you specifically about some of your findings and observations based on your polling, I am curious about, it seems like what happened coming out of the Goldwater era was that there did emerge a new generation of moderate Republicans. I'm wondering if you anticipate or see any sign or evidence that out of the Trump area, which has clearly galvanized the far right, it's galvanized people who weren't engaged in electoral politics. It's created, a party built around him. But do you see out of that any potential for moderation to emerge from Republicans?
Well, I think there is that potential. One of the big questions will be whether the people he has motivated into the political system, writ large, stay there. Is it just a personality cult, and will they become less interested and less likely to vote and all those things when he fades from the scene, or is it a real movement? The Goldwater effort was a movement. I mean, what we're seeing now is the culmination of a 50-year march in the Republican Party. The moderates today want to go back to the Reagan moderation era. And back in the 60s, Reagan was the radical right guy. The Evans people were fighting the Reagan people. And so
it's all how you define moderation, I guess.
Pardon?
That's all how you define moderation, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. Moderation has moved in the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And the Democrats still too have their two wings that they've had all along that bounce back and forth, and so there's always this dynamic. Both of the parties, however, have become more ideologically coherent, shall we say. There used to be much bigger tents. In this state, we used to elect Scoop Jackson and Henry Magnuson and Dan Evans all at the same time, and we vote for Lyndon Johnson and Dan Evans in the same year. And those sorts of overlaps, both nationally and increasingly here in the state, are pretty rare, if not extinct. And that's what I was looking at in this current piece here.
Yeah. So you are working with Crosscut. There's the Crosscut Elway poll that comes out not infrequently. You recently wrote for Crosscut about some of your findings and this increased polarization, and you wrote that it's harder. Washington doesn't do party registration, so we have kind of more fluid party ID as a result. But you talked about people identifying as Democrats and Republicans and how that's ebbed and flowed over the years and the decades. But you said that the gap between the parties has grown from a 5-point Democrat advantage prior to 2000 to a 15-point advantage in 2020, reflecting Washington's evolution from a battleground to a deep blue state, which is really interesting. And also, I still struggle with a little bit, because if you just look at the map, and we've got 39 counties, most of those counties are going to be red at the end of a statewide election. But as we know, the population base is in blue counties like King County, and 4 or 5 or 6 of them can easily sway a statewide election. But what is going on here?
Well, it's a little like the national map. When you look, if you do all this red and blue states and counties, the Republicans win the acres and the Democrats win the votes. As recently as 2000, Washington was considered a battleground state in the presidential election, at least early on. By the end, it was kind of off the map, but going into the 2000 election, it was a battleground. So I looked, as you said, we don't register by party identification in Washington State. So the only time anybody has to declare their party ID is when I call them on the phone and ask them, which I've been doing every month since 1992. And I asked it, the question I ask is, if you had to register by party in order to vote, would you register as Republican, Democrat, or Independent? So, and I went further back since I did that piece for Crosscut in the 90s. So during the Clinton administration, there was a 2-point gap. They were virtually even. That's how Washington became a battleground state in 2000. It was 31% Democrat, 29% Republican. It grew a little bit to a 4-point gap during the Bush administration, opened up to 10 points in the Obama administration, opened up further during the Trump administration, and the last 2 years since 2018, there's a 15-point difference. So it's 39% on average for those 2 years. 39% say they would register as Democrats, to 24% as Republicans. So the Democrats have gone up, Republicans have gone down. In the earlier days, when I was doing this before, I used to say Washington party ID was 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and the independents are the largest third. Well, that's no longer the case. The Democrats have established open water between them and the Republicans, and the Republicans have sunk about 5 points over the last 20 years.
So what does that say about the future of the Republican Party in this state? And you also looked at the demographics, where you noted that 71% of the Republicans were over the age of 50, compared to 60% of the Democrats.
Right.
You talked about the difference between Democrats and Republicans with respect to college degrees and graduate degrees. 63% of the Democrats were women, 57% of the Republicans were men. Where does the Republican Party go from here? Where do they go from there? Can they make up that open water?
That's the million-dollar question. And the biggest gap there that you just mentioned is the gender gap. 67% of all the Democrats in the state are women, and 59% of the Republicans are men. So we're separating There's a great book by Abramowitz called The Great Alignment that indicated that nationally the parties were separating by gender, we're separating by culture, we're separating by ideologically and race and geographically. Another book, the Big Sort, showed how people start to move to where they're more comfortable, actually, living where other people are like them more. So that the demographics of the parties are are separating. Again, used to be big tents, now not so much. And so, particularly in the geography, because our politics is organized by interests, but our government is organized by geography, and we are represented by districts. So the challenge is going to be making, when we've got redistricting coming up, and they're going to have a challenge to make representative districts. One of the things that has resulted from this party ID shift is the makeup of the legislature, and I'm talking not just about the majorities, but the districts themselves. And for example, in 1980, in the 1980 session, there were 13 districts that were represented entirely by Democrats, 2 representatives, 1 senator. So 13 blue districts, 16 red districts, and 20 purple districts. We had 20 districts that were represented by a mix of Republicans and Democrats. Today, we have 4 purple districts. We have 27 blue districts, 18 red districts. So this segregation or pulling apart or coagulation, whatever you want to call it, of the parties and identification is manifesting itself in our representation. So when we've got 4 purple districts now, and redistricting coming up, and we have 58% of the state's Democrats live in urban and suburban areas. 54% of the Republicans live in small towns or rural areas. You can see, the maps are going to change, and the growth in the last 10 years has been primarily in the urban districts, which tend to vote blue. So there's bound to be, I'm not a geographer and I'm not certainly on the commission, but there's bound to be more districts in the Puget Sound area, and the congressional districts are going to have to move west. There are 30% of the state's voters live in King County, 20% live in all of eastern Washington. And we used to have this cascade curtain. We used to talk about the eastern side of the state was mostly Republican, the western side of the state was mostly Democrat. That has evolved into more of an urban suburban or an urban rural split now, as the counties along the coast have started to turn red. Grays Harbor, Pacific, Cowlitz are voting for Republicans where they hadn't in a generation or two. And the concentration of the Democratic Party is more and more in the central North Puget Sound area. So the battleground used to be the suburbs, but as we know, there are no Republicans from King County anymore. I mean, one little corner maybe, and there are no Democrats in eastern Washington outside of the city of Spokane.
So what do you, yes. I mean, as redistricting is approaching here and actually starting to get underway, given what you've just described, it doesn't sound like there's any real chance that we're going to have more purple districts drawn. If anything, they're probably going to get more red and more blue.
It's going to be hard to draw purple districts just because of the residential patterns and the way the party identification has evolved in these different geographic or community types.
What do you make of, because you are from the Grays Harbor area. You grew up there. It was, I think when your father was a Republican running there and won, it was described in a piece that state historian John Hughes wrote as the bluest of blue, even nationally, and was until just very recently. And now we've seen those 3 legislative seats, I think it's the 19th district, flip to Republican. Right. What does that tell us about, maybe the question should be, what does that tell us about the Democratic Party at this point?
Well, yeah, that's the question, isn't it? Well, yeah, when I grew up down there, they still had pictures of Franklin Roosevelt hanging on the Union Hall walls into the 60s. The Grays Harbor County voted for Trump both times he ran. The last, no, they didn't. I don't think they did this time, but they did in 2016. The previous time, the last time they voted for a Republican was Herbert Hoover. So I think it is indicative. In a lot of ways, we think of Washington is somewhat of a bellwether for the country. I think every state probably thinks that, but Washington really is in a lot of ways. And the counties along the coast, the resource counties, the logging and fishing counties, feel a bit like the Midwest Rust Belt. They've sort of been left behind by the new economy, which is exploding in King County and driving the growth and the politics there. And there's a resentment of there's always been sort of a resentment of Seattle around the state. The Republicans a couple of years ago for the legislature, the legislative candidates were running against Seattle. That was their platform. We don't want Seattle's values to come and despoil our pristine communities. So that's been fostered, and there's fertile ground for that kind of resentment because the economy seems to be leaving them behind. And I think that got reflected in the votes. And so they've started to turn to the Republican Party, which has become more, at least nationally, and I guess statewide too here, try to be more a party of the forgotten working folks.
I want to mention a couple of your other findings because they're just very interesting. You asked about masks. 64% of Democrats said they always wear a mask. 60% of Republicans said they only wear one when they're required to do so because of the place that they're entering. You found that 75%, I really was surprised by this, 75% of Republicans would definitely not get the COVID vaccine. And,
well, it was definitely
definitely or
yeah.
It was would definitely not or wait and see. Combine those two numbers, you get to 75. Okay.
Yeah, you get to 75.
And then,
so,
and then you had 61% of Republicans saying they had no confidence or doubts about the election.
Well, that was a stunner. I mean, here's a state that we have voted by mail for how long now?
Mm-hmm. I think you said 15 years here.
Yeah, 15 years, and we're practically voting by mail before that. There were so many absentees, and the election system has been run by a Republican Secretary of State since 1964, and yet we have this huge block of Republicans say they don't have any or have very little faith that their vote was counted properly in Washington State. And both of those things, that and the mask, goes to how far we've come to where your party identification leads to your attitudes instead of the other way around. That a worldwide pandemic has become politicized. Wearing a mask for public health has become a partisan issue. Where are we? And we can doubt our own election system, which has worked flawlessly for all this time, because Donald Trump says the election was a fraud. So we're more and more people are seeing the world through their partisan lens. We've seen it nationally earlier when the Republicans are doubting the FBI and friendly to Russia and all these things that are just opposite of where Republicans were prior to Trump.
Well, we have a minute, less than a minute left, and I just want to ask you, because you say that independents still hold the balance of power. In 30 seconds or less, is there still a path for a moderate Republican candidate to not only get the support of the party, but then to win for governor in this state?
The Republicans in this state took a turn in the late 1980s. They sent a Pat Robertson delegation to the Republican convention.
Stu, I'm going to have you, just because I'm so short on time here, just in a nutshell, is it possible, or is that ship sailed?
It is possible. They've come close a couple of times. It is not. It doesn't look good. You get about 34% is your bedrock vote for Republicans. You've got to get all the rest of them.
Okay. Well, I'm going to stop you. There's so much more to talk about, and we will do it again. But thank you for joining us. Great to see you. And thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week. Have a good week.